Please join me in giving Tim Witsman a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I have to tell you something. I thoroughly enjoyed researching this one. I learned a lot, particularly about Grant. But probably the first thing one has to settle on is why these three guys. We've had other presidents who were generals. Andrew Jackson comes to mind, Zachary Taylor, Harrison. But I picked these three partly because it's a bear to talk about three in an hour. And who would those be? Well, Washington commanded the entire army, Grant commanded the entire army, and Ike commanded the largest army the United States has ever had. So I thought, and at critical times, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. So I thought they would make it do well. Some of you did hear the one on Washington, so I've cut that back a bit so that I can have more time for Grant and for Ike. Start off with Washington, kind of an interesting family. They were pro the king back during the Revolution, the English Revolution, and that turned out to be the wrong side. So they lost their status, their money, and ended up with not a lot. So one of the Washingtons came over to the colonies, and he has a partner. They make a deal. They come over and they traded, they got some tobacco, and then they managed to put it on a sandbar and ruin the entire thing. Lost every penny. And got in a lawsuit. Here's the funny part of that. The judge rules against the Washington, okay? Then loans him the money and gives him his daughter to marry. That happens to a lot of people out here, right? My life has just unfolded exactly like that. Anyway, the Washingtons did pretty well then. So George comes along, and I'll spend a little bit on each childhood. In George's case, he lost his dad at the age of about 11. And so his formal schooling was fairly limited. His mom was strong and opinionated, and he had to deal with that. But he had a brother, and there were a lot of these blended, a half-brother, a lot of these blended marriages back then because so many people died, particularly the women in things like childbirth. But this stepbrother did very well by him. And did about as well as you could do in trying to be a father. One of the things that George got into, which John gave me a copy of, was a book on civility and how to behave. It was actually an old 17th century book from the Jesuits, so a little out of date by the time he got it. And it's where not to touch yourself in public and all kinds of little instances like that. But this is a critical thing, and I want to mention this very strongly because it is the essence of George Washington. How many of you have ever seen a movie called The Triumph of Will? 1, 2. Okay, made by Leni Riefenstahl. It's a propaganda film for Hitler made from one of the Nuremberg rallies. And in Hitler's case, will is the imposition of his will on other people, countries, everything. Washington does the far harder thing, the exact opposite. For him, will is the control of yourself. That's what it's all about. And from the time that he is an adolescent, he is absolutely focused on that. He was interested in fame. So at one point, he wanted to be in the British Navy. His mom wouldn't sign the papers for that. That would not have worked. By the way, Napoleon also wanted to be in the British Navy. Why? Because that's where the action was. British Navy was the place to go do exciting things. But his mom wouldn't sign for it, and he wouldn't have done well anyway because you had to have what was called interest. It's a different word than the way we think of it. Interest meant you had pull. You had people who would push for you when it came time for promotion. Without it, you weren't going anywhere. Later on, he was interested in the British Army, and from the beginning, he exhibited sort of irrational bravery. In the first conflict that he was really involved in, all the other British soldiers all the ones who were on horses got knocked off, killed, mortally wounded, except for him. Bullets through the coat, bullets through everything, loses horses, but not George. But they would never make him a regular British officer. Now you have to understand this kind of dichotomy. I love this stuff because I've always considered myself an outsider, and I kind of revel a little bit in that. Washington wants to be included by this, the British aristocracy. They don't want him. What is he? He's a provincial. In our terms, he's a hick. Okay? They're not just a hick. But even within your own society, there are people who are thought of as, way up there, and the Washingtons certainly were. I'm amused when I move from state to state. I've lived in a bunch of them. And there's always within each state sort of the in crowd. They went to the right local state school, et cetera, and others who sort of aren't. And it's amusing because it's provincial. Everybody's provincial in that sense. But one of the things that's so important about George is he wanted to become the George Washington we know. I mean, that was his goal, to be that, whatever that was. And at first that was through military activity. Well, George was interesting. He loved the life of a country squire. I mean, he liked that stuff. He liked the hunting, the dancing, he loved all that. It wasn't enough, and he had to have something more. When the war comes along, and he does get the opportunity to be the head of the army, you see another thing about Washington. This guy is a learner, always a learner. Earlier, British writer had come over and toured the colonies and called Mount Vernon the best run farm in the colonies. Well, he probably didn't see them all, doesn't matter if it was number one. But the point was, this guy knows how to manage. I mean, he really knows how to do things. And he was constantly learning. He was reading the latest science on what you could do in agriculture. So on the way to take over the Continental Army, what does he do? He stops for two things that are absolutely pure Washington. Uniform, you got to look the part. And two, books, because he doesn't know how to run an army. And in each case, in all three of these guys, you start out with people, nobody knows how to run that many men. So he takes that job over, and he knows he doesn't know that much. I'm going to skip ahead. One thing about Washington in terms of his presentation, people see him as this very aloof stone, and that's not entirely true. The people who knew him said he was very social. He could be enjoyable to spend time with, but he was reserved. You know how today people say incredibly stupid things come out of people's mouths, and you think, do you have any filters? Any? Washington had a string of filters. He was going to be very careful of what he said or what he wrote. One time, some people who knew him well were talking about him, and they said, well, I don't think George will mind. I'm going to go over and put my hand on his shoulder. So he goes over and he puts his hand on Washington's shoulder. Washington looks at the hand, looks at him like, how dare you? Who do you think you are? So he wanted to keep that reserved. And he did not want to be president. You see, when he resigned his commission, resigned the head of the army, went home, he became what George III said was, well, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. Yeah, he was. And everybody knew it. And that's what he wanted. He now had Mount Vernon, which he loved, and he had the fame. There's nothing more the guy wants. But the country absolutely has to have him as that first president. There isn't anybody else. Everybody's agreed on it. And in fact, if you read the Constitution, the portions about the legislature are pretty specific. What the legislature can do, what powers, etc. The presidency, it's vague. Why? Because George is going to be the guy, and everybody trusts George. They don't know what it's going to look like. Everything the man did was a precedent. He knew it was a precedent. He thought this stuff through. He was deliberate. Some people thought a little slow, but he was deliberate in thinking through, what's the effect going to be of this? What's that going to play like later on? How's that going to work? Another thing was that divisions began to happen, of course, between Jefferson-Madison group versus Hamilton and the Federalists. And one of those big divisions had to do with France. France had then gone through the revolution. We had a treaty with them which said we would stand by their side in the event of war. We didn't do that. Washington was not going to get us in a war. Jefferson and Madison were furious about that, thought that we had to live up to our obligations, saw the American Revolution, a bit like the Soviets saw theirs at one time, as the beginning of this worldwide revolution. And France was the next. Washington's answer was, we're neutral. We're not getting in a war. And his basic thinking was, there's no future if we go mess with Europe. That's not where the American future lies. The American future lies west. And after he was president, what he spent time on were things like, they called them internal improvements at the time, canals, anything to improve commerce. So he had a very strong sense of that. And he definitely didn't want a war. He did not want to serve a second term. He didn't want to serve first term, but he really didn't want to serve a second term because he knew what politics was like and he hated it. But both Hamilton, the head of the Federalists, and Madison come to him. I mean, when both sides say, you have to do this, the point I'm trying to make is the level of trust there, absolute trust. And I said it before, but when he died, I'll give you three things. George III, his nemesis in the war, said he's the greatest man of our age. Napoleon declared 10 days of mourning, and the British Navy flew its flags at half-staff. Those are your enemies. That's what they think of you. So there's my point about him. Now we'll go to Grant. Grant, another interesting background. His mother, almost no emotional content at all. Never came to see him. Even when he's in the White House, never came to see him. He mentions her once in his memoirs. Only once. So she is just sort of a non-entity in his whole life. The father was best described as a loquacious braggart. And in fact, Grant had trouble with him later. He came to Shiloh and wanted to try to make money, and Grant had to kick him out. He had to kick his own father out. So they had a interesting relationship. But one of the things you find out about Grant is, more than anybody that I've ever seen, he learned how to live on his own. He learned how to do things. He started trading horses at a very early age. Everybody around would bring their horses to him because he was a great horseman. He'd break them. Once he wanted to buy this horse and for $10, and his dad says, it's not worth it. Tells him, okay, here's some money, go to him, get the guy down. Grant burbles out, well, my dad said, to ask this price and then this price and then agree to the $10. It was Grant's problem. He's just way too straightforward about all this stuff, and he trusted people. When he was about 11, he would take 50-mile trips on his own. Now we're talking about on the edge of the wilderness. By the time he's an adolescent, he's taking 200-mile trips on his own. You let your kids do that? I mean, that's Wichita to Kansas City, except there's a whole bunch of trees and Native Americans in between. And that's what he was doing. Okay, Mexican War. Before the Mexican War, Grant wanted something else. He was in the military, not doing terribly well. Guess what he wanted to be? Anybody know? He wanted to be the math professor at West Point. He was a good math student. And he'd written the commandant and asked, and apparently it would probably have been regarded favorably, but the Mexican War breaks out. And And he's not the only one who's brave in this war, but he does things like, some of you are old enough to remember the old cowboy movies, and the cowboy is riding along, holding on the side of the horse's neck. Remember that? One leg over. He did that. They ran out of ammunition, and so he had to go back to get ammunition and other things, and he actually pulled that one off. But he was also a quartermaster, and that's important for later on. He understood logistics. That was his job. He understood what it takes for an army to be able to do its job. Drinking, yep. And you know what his big problem was? He could not tolerate alcohol at all. One drink and he was tipsy, 2 drinks and he couldn't walk a straight line. He only weighed about 120 pounds, 130, and he just couldn't tolerate it. And did he ever drink? Oh yeah. Did he ever drink in any important time? No. There's no evidence that, before Shiloh or before any important times, he did not. But he did have a problem. He'd been completely unsuccessful. He was a clerk in his father's business when the war broke out. And this is not a guy who's seeking fame in the way that George Washington was. George matured and, directed that in a very productive way. On the Mexican War, Grant's take was, it was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. In a very strong sense, it was a terrible war, we shouldn't have done it. But the war begins, and he gets his opportunities. And one of the first things that happens is he's leading men looking for this Confederate force. And his heart's jumping out of his chest. It's not because he's afraid. He has no fear. It's just not in the guy. But what he's worried about is the men. He's worried about the responsibility of these people that he's leading. And so he gets up there and finds the Confederates have turned around and left. And he said, by God, they're scared of them as we are of, they're as scared of us as we are of them. And he said, never worried about it again. That was it. We're done. From Zachary Taylor, he had learned calm. I don't know how many of you know Zachary Taylor. He was one of the 2 big generals in the Mexican War. Taylor's the one who drove toward Monterrey. Winfield Scott's the one who came in from Veracruz. And he was a very, very good general. But he wouldn't wear a military uniform. He'd sit on his horse, not side saddle, but sideways, very calmly, and just sit there with his head down and direct the battles in civilian clothes. And so Grant had learned something from him. One of the things about Grant that I'm going to recommend to you, if you're interested in anything like this, read his memoirs. The reason? He is the clearest writer I have ever read in all of history. Nobody writes more clearly than Grant. And that's not just my observation. The first day he met his wife, Julia, she wrote down that he described something to her. And she said, that was the clearest description I have ever heard in my life. So he did have that gift. Very early on, he meets Sherman. Sherman, in an interesting way, outranks Grant. And so he offers to Grant, after Grant's first couple of successes, he says, this is a guy who can get things done. He said, you can have any of my men you want, and if you want, I will serve under you, even though I outrank you. Now, among the egos of the time, that's unusual, folks. But also as part of Sherman, he did not want to be number 1. He wanted to be underneath somebody. And I'm going to try to give you a sense of the clarity of Grant and what he brought to the table. So he's been put in charge of the West, finally. And a Union general has pushed down to Chattanooga, pushed the Confederates into Georgia, and instead of pushing on, goes back and settles down in Chattanooga, gets himself virtually surrounded. Supply line cut off. And another Union army under Burnside stuck in the same way. So they tell Grant. Grant's 200 miles away, gets on a horse and rides and no, not 200 miles, but it took him 2 full days of riding after being on trains. and he had a bad leg. His horse had fallen on him. This happened several times, happened at Shiloh too. Horse had fallen on, very bad, fell on him again on the trip. They had to actually lift him out of the saddle and put him down when he got to the place. So he's been in the rain, he's barely eaten for 2 days, hadn't slept, and he arrives. He eats a light supper, and then he asks, bring the generals in, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and Baldy Smith. And they describe the positions, describe what's going on. Grant listens very quietly, then he asks questions, which they said were incredibly probing and showed us that he had studied the ground and understood the positions and everything else. Then he goes to bed. Next day, he goes out and examines lines. Now, he's crazy brave too. This guy would go out anywhere and just go up to the lines and look. He gets shot at all the time. But he goes up, and then he comes back and issues orders. And I'll tell you about one of his going up to the lines. He sits down at a table, takes out a bunch of papers, writes out orders for Sherman, you're going to go relieve Burnside. Everybody in his command for thousands of miles, he writes out an order to. Then and they immediately were impressed with his grasp, his promptness, and his administrative capabilities. But he goes down to Chattanooga Creek in the morning, and Union on one side, Confederates on the other. From the Union side comes out, turn out the guard, commanding general. From the Confederate side comes, turn out the guard, commanding general, Grant. And you think, oh my God, this isn't going to end well. No, the Confederates come to attention. He goes down to the creek and talks to them. Okay, how you doing, son? Where are you from? That kind of stuff. Anyway, part of what I'm trying to get across this, we admire people like a Washington or a Grant, and partly it's happenstance. They're so bloody lucky to have lived. I mean, if you think of how many people were dying of diseases, bullets, I mean, Washington would go right in front, right between the American and the British lines, 30 yards away, and they don't shoot him. Huh? Grant did this over and over. One time he was on a steamer, and he laid down for 30 seconds when he got there. And he got up because he was going to do something, walks to the other guy in the cabin, and the cabin was not very big in those days, and a bullet goes right through the headboard and would have killed him. Yeah. So some of this is just happenstance. I can't give explanations for it. One of the things also about Grant is he absolutely refused to turn back from anything, and it drove his staff crazy. They'd be down in Virginia where they don't really have maps. They don't know where these things go. The Confederates are moving along with him, and they're saying, no, we don't want to keep going. We may just run into them there. Let's go back, find another way. Grant would refuse, and they had to do terrible things to get the guy to just turn back. Now, I get that one. I'm one of those people who, if I'm 5 miles from the house on a 700-mile trip and I remember I forgot something, too bad. Just keep going. So that part I do understand. When he took over, Lincoln made him general-in-chief. Now he's got all the armies. And one of the problems was George Meade, how many remember that name? The guy who won the Battle of Gettysburg, a very competent general, kind of a sour guy. They call him a mean old snapping turtle. Just a difficult personality, but a very competent man. So Grant takes over all the armies, and he leaves Meade in command. After a while, some of the other people on the staff come to him and say, what the heck are you doing? Why do you, this is a charade. Just get rid of Meade, you don't need him because you're giving the orders. And Grant, very clear-eyed as always, just said, no, if I were head of the Army of the Potomac, I have to do all that administrative work, I have to deal with all the personnel issues, all the logistics. Meade is very competent, he's totally loyal, I don't have any worries about him. He stays in command. Just pure Grant, What's the mission? Do what's necessary. The only time anybody saw him really mad in the war was when somebody did something to horses. He had one guy tied to a tree for beating a horse for hours. He had very strong views about rights, and we're going to find that from Washington all the way through to Ike. One of those things had to do with treatment of black prisoners. When the South treated black prisoners differently than white prisoners, he wouldn't do exchanges with them. No exchanges until you treat them the same way you treat others. And he had a very interesting, from the beginning of the war, he had a view of the South that was intriguing. I mean, he'd really thought about this stuff. He said, best thing that can happen for the South is to lose this war fast, because they have no future. Their political economy, the way the whole thing is put together, it cannot last. That will fall apart, and they're going to be in a terrible mess with all those slaves. At the end of the war, he did send troops down to the Mexican border without orders. He did that on his own. And that was to let Napoleon III of France know, don't you go messing around anymore in Mexico, because we're prepared to go do something about that. It wasn't against the Mexicans, it was against Napoleon's adventures there. Very much a hard war, soft peace man, as was Sherman, as was Lincoln, and Churchill. They would have all understood very much. If you're in war, you pursue the heck out of it. In fact, Grant's most often used phrase was, keep the ball moving. Don't stop. What ticked him off was when somebody would not pressure. I'll just give you the final strategy. When he took over, at the beginning of the war, Winfield Scott, who'd been the head of the Army, had the Anaconda strategy. We were going to blockade the southern ports, we're going to come down the Mississippi, and we're going to squeeze them. Nobody wanted that because it would take too long. It would work, but it would just take too long. When Grant took over, he said, that strategy is correct, but from now on, we are not going to give them any rest. He initiated 5 campaigns, 3 by political generals, 2 by pros, Sherman and himself. The 3 political ones all failed. Didn't matter, it kept them busy. The idea was, don't let the Confederacy transfer. Don't let them transfer people, keep them under pressure the whole time. So he had a very strong idea of what to do. As president, you know what his phrase was when he ran for president? Let us have peace. Very much like Washington. We had claims with the British over the Alabama, a raider that they had built and claimed were not siding with the South, but it was bogus. So he submitted that to international arbitration. First time the U.S. had done that, and we won. The Brits paid us, I can't remember how many millions of dollars. He used the military against the KKK. He went into about 5 different states with the military. Now this is interesting. The second time, remember Washington used the military against civilians? Shays' Rebellion?
Yeah, the Whiskey Rebellion.
Well, he sent them, in fact, he led the army. There was no fight because nobody would want to fight with him. And then Native Americans. This is another interesting thing. I think people don't know the history. Oftentimes, the government actually did want to do the right thing by Native Americans, but whatever deals we made, settlers always went in and blew them up, and nobody had the political will to fight with settlers. Grant felt the same way. During the time he was in office, Native American land cultivated increased 6 times, and housing 7 times. So he was very interested in that and cared about it. Okay, to Ike. His family. His father was also a strange duck. He had lost a small fortune, solemn, introverted, stubborn, humorless. The only reason they have that house, because I could never figure out how they were poor, but the house ain't that bad, right? The family bought the house for him. The dad had lost the money, and the family did it. The mother, she was from what were River Brethren, became Jehovah's Witness, very anti-war, optimistic, perky. He called her saintly, a worker, an administrator, a teacher, a guide, wonderful. She's an incredible gal. And it's always irritated the hell out of me that the media focus on the Kennedys. Now, I don't have anything against Jack Kennedy. I think he was a pretty good president, actually. But I don't get a bunch of rich kids from a dad who was a bootlegger and, was sympathetic to Hitler. I don't get it. The Eisenhowers were the following. Arthur became executive VP and director of Commerce Bank. Edgar went to Michigan Law, formed the Tacoma firm. Roy was a pharmacist in Junction City. Earl, an engineer for a public utility, GM of newspapers, known to radio stations. Milton, high government positions, president of K-State, Penn State, and Johns Hopkins. Ike, of course, became president of Columbia. But in addition from that, those same class there was another guy who became president of Cornell. Imagine that. President of 3 different Ivy League schools out of this one little school. Same time. Okay. Ike was the most like his mom. He had a magnetic personality, and everybody liked him. He missed World War I. He had other assignments here. In fact, one of them was to transport things all the way across the country. It took him 6 weeks, given our road system at that time. He was a staff officer. He wanted to he wanted to run, put me in charge of a division and let me do something. Nope, never happened. Because he was so darn good at the work that the higher-ups always grabbed him and put him on the staff work. He was just too smart. One of the things that did happen early on was the loss of a child. And this is one of those hard things for me to understand because it hadn't happened to me that way, but boy, things in a family are never the same. And his and Mamie's relationship was never quite what it was after the death of that child. He spent about 8 years with MacArthur here in the States and over in the Philippines. And there's a wonderful exchange. Later on, when I became prominent, he was a nothing at the time. Somebody asked MacArthur, "Didn't Ike serve under you?" He says, "Yes, best clerk I ever had." So somebody went to Eisenhower and said, "Didn't you serve under MacArthur?" He said, "No, I studied drama under MacArthur." Kind of fun, huh? But he was #1 at Command and Staff College, and George Marshall picked him, kept giving him assignments, increasing assignments, promotes him over 162 other generals. He not only writes the plans for Western Europe, but when we conceive that we're going to have a unified command, he's told, write that up. Now that's never been done before. I mean, this is all tabula rasa. There is no textbook for how do you do that. Eisenhower writes up how that would work. Marshall, a tough taskmaster, looks at it, changes one minor thing in it, and then says to Ike, "Okay, go do it." Ike goes, "Huh? You're in charge. Go." What? But he's now head of the Allied armies. I don't have time to talk about battles and all that stuff very much. But if you are aware, when the United States first got into the war in the western part, not the east, it was in North Africa. And frankly, we didn't perform very well. We were pretty bad. And it's understandable. You've got a civilian army, you don't know who leaders are, you don't know who's any good. Patton emerged, obviously, as somebody who knew how to fight, but so many of them did not. Well, the British generals came out of that and said, this guy has no experience as a field commander. None. We have no respect for that. You've got to put somebody in charge as the field commander. So when they went into Sicily, it was Alexander. When they go into Normandy, initially, it was Montgomery, but they put somebody on the ground. But here's the other side of that, very interesting. They universally agreed he was the only person who could be Supreme Commander. And I remember a British historian talking to one of the British generals, and they said, Eisenhower was that important? And the guy said, he was the only indispensable man in the war. And the historian said, what do you mean? What about Churchill? He said, well, Churchill, when we were standing alone, he's the guy who, kept Western civilization. But he said, once the Americans were in it, absolutely it was Eisenhower. And the reason was, he was the only one who could deal with all these egomaniacs. Think of the people he had to deal with. You got to deal with Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, who could be brilliant, was also a meddler and had all kinds of bad ideas on top of being wonderful. Patton, an egomaniac. Montgomery, de Gaulle. I mean, you could not find a more difficult bunch, more opinionated bunch of people. And he's got to deal with them and conduct a war at the same time. Very, very tough stuff. On Ike, one of the things I do remember, because I've seen him do this, it was his speech at Sandhurst. You know what Sandhurst is? It's the British equivalent of West Point. So he goes there and he stands, no notes, parade rest, and delivers his speech. And what struck me was how pure Eisenhower was. He tells them, okay, you've had the best education, you're going to have the best equipment. That's not what matters. What matters is you're going to be responsible for those men, some of whom are almost twice your age, and you had better do that well. And he delivers this thing. It's a very, very well done speech, and a speech that many leaders should listen to. A second little vignette of Eisenhower is when the American troops got to the concentration camps. The first thing he did was say, you get the cameras in there, you get every German nearby in there, make them see what was going on if they claim they didn't, and you get every American soldier within 50 miles, because they will deny this ever happened. And I want our guys to know why they're fighting. I want the world to be able to see it. So he took Patton with him. Patton couldn't take it. He asked to go outside and threw up. Couldn't stand it. But Ike was perfectly right on that whole thing. He also could be ruthless. And the most interesting one on that has to do with Kay Summersby. You familiar with that name? That was his driver. Very pretty English lady. And yes, they denied anything until both Ike and Mamie were dead, and then she wrote a book and said, yeah, we did. At the end of the war, Ike wrote to Marshall, who's the chief of staff of the Army, and says, what would happen if I were to divorce Mamie and marry Kay? And Marshall replies, but he also sends this to Truman. And Marshall said, I'll bust you to private. Truman said, tell him I'll bust his ass back to Kansas. After which, Eisenhower wrote to a very formal note to Kay Summersby thanking her for all her service in the war. Okay. Thinking of D-Day 1964. Any of you see that when Walter Cronkite interviewed Ike? And he asked him, what were you thinking about on the day of D-Day? Any personal stuff? And Ike said two things. My mother, who was against war, and I'd promised her I'd work for peace if ever I got in a position to. And my son graduated from West Point that day, and I did not want him to have to come over here and do it again. Now, I believe those two. I mean, hear politicians say things, but that I believe because it's about your family. As president, I'll try to get through this as fast as I can so we've got time for a few questions. He knew everybody. Understand? I mean, he knew Zhukov. He knew the head of the Russian army. He knew the head of everything. That's a different situation than we have today. He did propose the Open Skies program. The idea was both we and the Russians could fly over and see anything the other one had. Well, the Russians weren't going to do that. And like the other two, he used American troops domestically. Remember? This has to do with segregation. Nationalized the National Guard, sent them in. And there's a phrase that always intrigued me, in the Brown versus Board of Education case. The court ordered that desegregation happen with all deliberate speed. Well, that actually came out of the U.S. Attorney brief. But do you know where it came from? Eisenhower's words. What he meant was as fast as we can do it without ripping the country apart. And that's a pure Eisenhower. Vision, well, you got the interstate system, the St. Lawrence Seaway, balanced the budget, did not eliminate the New Deal, and his warnings about not only the military-industrial complex, but government getting in cohorts with science, and the danger of that. Okay, commonalities on these guys. Trust. That's what all three of them had, absolute trust. Why in Ike's case? Because if you ask those other people, they said he was absolutely fair. That you might not get what you want, but you would always get a fair hearing with Ike. He'd listen to you and give you a fair chance. Management. I'm amused that historians never talk much about management when they talk about leaders, etc., because they're not familiar with it. They've never done it. These guys are managers. These are not people who are going to write flowery poetry about something. They manage and do it very well. Also, working with others. In Washington's case, he had to work with the French. You know, domestically, we didn't supply him with very much. Congress didn't give him much of anything. The French did, and he needed to get along with them, and he did that very well. With Grant, it was the Navy. From the very beginning, when he was working on the rivers in the Midwest, he worked with Commodore Foote, later Admiral Porter, and others, and worked extremely well. They did a great job with him. And he kind of pioneered this multi-service approach to getting things done. And for Ike, it was the Allies. And let me give you one more example of Ike and trust on this. After the war, the German chancellor was a man named Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer is from the Christian Democrats, tough guy. And one time he was being interviewed. And the interviewer was asking about some decision the US had made, and it was very unpopular in Germany. It was not something the Germans wanted. And so he asked Adenauer about it, and Adenauer says, well, Eisenhower made me a promise. And the guy said, well, yeah, fine, you know, but, and Adenauer looks at him as only a German can and says, Eisenhower made me a promise. Next question. You know, like, that's the end of it. That's all I need. That's all anybody in Germany should need, is Eisenhower's promise. We're done. Strategy. All three of them understood strategy. You know, Washington, maybe not initially, but he quickly learned that what he had to do is preserve the army and wear out the British. Grant, I talked about the 5 campaigns. Ike, as president, what he did, remember, these guys didn't get anybody killed. Nobody got killed in the war with them. In Ike's case, he'd threatened nuclear because he did not want to go actually put guys in harm's way. That was the threat. If the Soviets got a little too far, he just said, I'm willing to push that button. On war, I think this is what's so important. You got 3 guys who've been through war, and all 3 of them don't want to see it. And it's Washington who established that civilian authority. The day that he gave up his commission and went home, that established civilian authority in this country. And I've always been amused by movies and such about generals going to take over something. The American military ain't ever going to do that. It's not in them. If you've worked with them, you know that is not conceivable to them. The American military is subordinate to civilian authority. I'm going to give you one final quote, and this is from Grant writing about Zachary Taylor, who he served under. He said, "No soldier could face danger or responsibility more calmly than he. These qualities are more rarely found than genius or physical courage." Our fortune as Americans is we had 3 people who had those characteristics at the most important times. Thank you.
Any questions?
I just wanted to say something. I was in Germany for a year, and I studied there, and I went to Dachau, Western. people, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that Eisenhower brought them in. Because again, a lot of the Germans didn't even know this was going on.
Well, that was a claim. You'd have to not have a nose and be able to smell in many of the places to not know it.
What you said about Ulysses S. Grant, I think people forget that there was a president between Lincoln and Grant, and Andrew Johnson almost one term, 3.5 years. During that time, what was Grant's relationship with the president, and wasn't he really the one that held the country together during one of our darkest hours?
I don't know that I know enough to answer it. Johnson was just a strange character, and he started out sort of one direction in terms of reconciliation, and then ended up going in another direction. I don't know whether Grant really wanted to be president initially. Sherman kept telling him, "Don't do it, they'll eat you up," and of course they did. He was far too naive, and he was a terrible businessman. I mean, he couldn't do anything right in business, just couldn't. But I don't know that I know enough to tell you exactly what their relationship was. He was head of the army.
Right.
That was his job.
The war wasn't over when Lincoln was shot.
Not quite.
Tim, fascinating comparison. Really enjoyed it. A couple questions. Of those three, Grant's presidency is not rated highly, and any comment on that would be the Kennedy historians sort of say Ike was a terrible president, and the more recent political scientist talks about the hidden hand presidency. And I'm kind of curious if you had any insight about where that came from.
Okay, take me back to the first one again. Just say one word and I'll... Oh, as president. Yeah, there's no question. There's no question of corruption. I mean, it was a Gilded Age. There was tons of money. Ethics were not in high regard at his time. But there were things he did well. The civil rights things, I think he did well. The keeping us out of any further conflicts. With a different set of circumstances, he might have done better. But he really was lacking in the kinds of toughness that an FDR would have had, to deal with some of those people. He just didn't have it. Eisenhower, I didn't understand those who, there were so many funny things back then. There was this stuff about Adlai Stevenson being the intellectual. That's who ran against Ike twice. He's an Illinois politician. Have you ever met an Illinois politician? Here's Eisenhower, number one at Command and Staff College, schooled in the entire world, and the other guy's the intellectual? Excuse me? I don't get that. Ike was a very good manager, and his policy was absolutely conscious. It was, the American people have gone through the Depression, World War II, and Korea. They need calm. And it's a time for business. And that's what the other two guys thought too. Washington, that's what he wanted. That's what Grant wanted. We've been through the war. We've done all that stuff. Now let's settle down and let's create. And I think he was right. We done?
Hang on just a minute.
Oh.
Just a minute. This is a thank you. I hope you haven't already bought that.
I have not. Thank you.
That's a Wichita hero there.
I appreciate
And,
that.
I thought you'd enjoy it.
Yep.
I just wanted to say a couple of words, if you'll allow me this. I'll be nice. Tim is very easy to be acquainted with because he's a true gentleman. I have known Tim for a long time, and he's always been considerate of other people's views and positions. Even though he may disagree, he will take time to explain the other side of the story. Tim is always well informed about the issues and has been one of Wichita's most outstanding citizens. We are very grateful to Tim for his participation with the Wichita Pachyderm Club. This is the third time he has been one of our presenters. We hope to see a lot of Tim in the future, and I mean that sincerely.
Thank you so much.
And thank you. Let's give him a standing thank you.